In the dust-choked, climate-controlled silence of the Louisiana State Archives, a single piece of paper, yellowed and fragile as a dead leaf, tells a story of profound and calculated horror. It is a marriage certificate, and its very existence is a testament to an evil that time has failed to erase or forgive. An archivist might handle it with sterile gloves, seeing only a historical curiosity, but to look closer is to feel a chill creep up your spine. The names it bears are Jeremiah Aldrich and a woman listed only as Celeste, her identity, her very soul, reduced to a line item, mere property, beneath his looping, arrogant signature. What transforms this document from a grotesque relic into the opening chapter of a nightmare is not just the unholy union between a plantation owner and his enslaved cook, but the 13 mysterious, agonizing deaths that began to plague his estate in the months following their ceremony in March of 1854. Faded, brittle newspapers from the period, tucked away in the climate-controlled vaults of private collections, whisper of a conspiracy so vast and so cruel that the local authorities, fearing the catastrophic fallout, buried the investigation to shield some of Louisiana's most powerful and respected families. The truth of this forced marriage unspools a chilling saga of betrayal, a meticulously planned revenge, and a campaign of systematic psychological and physical torture that would have sickened even the violence-hardened society of the antebellum South. Before we delve into the story of Jeremiah Aldrich and the hellish, well-deserved fate that awaited him at Willowbrook Plantation, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and share in the comments what state you're listening from. Now, allow me to transport you to a time when a man's honor was his most prized possession, and a shattered trust could unleash a retribution far more creative and agonizing than a simple death. The toxic roots of that monstrous marriage treaty were planted 15 years earlier, in the sweltering, mosquito-thick backwaters of the Mississippi Delta. This was a world where vast fortunes were built upon the buying and selling of human flesh, and blood money flowed as thick and fast as the muddy, indifferent river itself. Jeremiah Aldrich was not a man born to the plantation aristocracy that ruled Louisiana society in the 1840s. He was the son of a failed Kentucky tobacco farmer, arriving in the humid, chaotic port of New Orleans in 1839 with nothing to his name but a fire of raw ambition in his belly and a chilling willingness to dirty his hands in business that more established gentlemen wouldn't touch with their finest silk gloves. He walked the streets, smelling the sweet rot of jasmine and decay, watching the Creole elite glide by in their carriages, and a cold, hard resentment took root in his heart. The slave trade, while legal, was a stain upon the reputations of these old families. They preferred the elegant fiction that their wealth sprang from the earth, from the sweet toil of sugar and the white gold of cotton, not from the brutal, systematic commodification of human souls in the city's notorious markets. It was in the oppressive, suffocating heat of the summer of 1840 that Aldrich found his partners in damnation, Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle, two men whose own desperation was a perfect match for his ruthless drive. Devo, the youngest son of a declining sugar baron, was drowning in his father's debts, frantically seeking funds to save his family's crumbling plantation from the auction block. He was a man weakened by privilege, unsuited for the world he found himself in. Rochelle, a former ship captain with eyes that had seen too much, had lost his fortune to a bout of yellow fever and a series of disastrous investments. He possessed an invaluable, intimate knowledge of the illegal slave routes snaking from Cuba and the Caribbean islands, a web of corruption and violence he knew how to navigate. Together, they forged a partnership they called the Delta Trading Company. Their base of operations was a cavernous, rat-infested warehouse on the frayed edges of New Orleans, a place smelling of bilge water and despair, where the city's laws grew thin and no one asked inconvenient questions about the origins of their human merchandise. The business proved more profitable than any of them had dared to dream. While legitimate traders dealt in documented human property, with clear titles and falsified health certificates, Aldrich's operations specialized in what they cynically termed recovery services. They bought enslaved people who had bravely escaped from failing plantations, purchased free black men and women kidnapped by corrupt bounty hunters, and, most lucratively of all, smuggled fresh captives from the illegal ships that still haunted the Atlantic despite the official ban on the international slave trade. The profits were obscene because their costs were virtually non-existent. They saw the people chained in the holds of their ships not as human beings, but as perishable goods, their suffering a mere line item in a ledger. For 3 years, their dark enterprise flourished in the shadows. They laundered their profits, reinvesting them into legitimate businesses and buying respectability one parcel of land at a time. Devo rescued his family's plantation, transforming it into one of the most productive sugar operations in St. Charles Parish, his relief palpable. Rochelle acquired a fleet of riverboats, rebranding himself as a respected shipping magnate, the ghost of his past failures finally laid to rest. Aldrich himself purchased Willowbrook Plantation, a profitable cotton operation 40 miles upriver from the city, complete with a grand colonial mansion whose gleaming white columns announced his violent arrival into Louisiana's planter elite. But their success bred a dangerous carelessness, a swaggering arrogance, and that carelessness began to attract the wrong kind of attention. In the spring of 1843, a chilling whisper reached them. Federal marshals were investigating illegal slave trading along the Gulf Coast. Someone had been asking pointed questions, poring over shipping records, and, worst of all, interviewing some of their former merchandise who had managed to find freedom. The three partners convened an emergency meeting in Aldrich's new study at Willowbrook, a room filled with leather-bound books he could not read and oil paintings of ancestors who were not his own. The air in that room was thick with fear, suffocating, as each man confronted the terrifying reality that their empire of human misery was on the verge of collapsing. Devo, his face pale and slick with sweat, frantically suggested they dissolve the partnership and burn every last record. Rochelle, ever the pragmatist, argued for a calmer strategy: shift their assets offshore and wait for the storm to pass. But Jeremiah Aldrich had a different solution, one born from the coldest, blackest recesses of his morally bankrupt soul. He had already made his decision. He would not just dissolve the partnership, he would eliminate it. He would murder his partners and seize their combined fortunes for himself. But the plan had to be perfect, removing all suspicion while permanently silencing the only two men who could send him to the gallows. The idea came to him with the cold, crystalline clarity of pure evil. He would kill them both and stage the scene to look as if they had murdered each other in a furious dispute over money. With Devo and Rochelle dead, he would emerge as the sole, tragic survivor, free to erase the evidence of their crimes while consolidating their wealth. The murders took place on a humid, suffocating evening in June 1843, back at the warehouse that had birthed their unholy alliance. The air was heavy with the smell of the river and decay. Aldrich had called the meeting under the pretense of finalizing their exit strategy. He chose the location with care. The warehouse district was a ghost town after sunset, and the building itself was slated for demolition, a convenient erasure of any lingering evidence. Aldrich arrived early, the weight of the loaded pistol in his coat a comforting presence, the razor-sharp skinning knife tucked into his boot a promise of finality. His plan was brutally simple: shoot Devo first, then orchestrate a messy knife fight with Rochelle that would leave both men dead and him with a plausible claim of self-defense. He had even hired his witnesses, 3 dockhands who, for a handful of silver, would swear they saw Devo and Rochelle arguing violently about missing funds earlier that day. When his partners arrived, Aldrich was a mask of calm, seated at their familiar planning table. A bottle of expensive whiskey and 3 glasses sat between stacks of ledgers, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The conversation began as planned. Devo nervously reviewed the legal threats. Rochelle outlined a scheme to transfer their assets to banks in Havana. But as the whiskey flowed, Aldrich expertly steered the conversation towards their hidden wealth, the specific locations of their cash reserves. It was Rochelle who first felt the cold prickle of dread. The old sailor's instincts, sharpened by decades in dangerous ports, detected a subtle shift in Aldrich's demeanor. The way his eyes darted, never quite meeting theirs. The way his hand kept drifting unconsciously toward his coat pocket, the strained tightness in his voice. When Rochelle suggested they postpone the meeting, to reconvene with their lawyers, Aldrich knew his moment had come. The window was closing. The violence was an explosion of shocking speed. Aldrich drew the pistol and fired point-blank into Marcus Devo's chest. The gunshot roared through the cavernous warehouse like a thunderclap. Devo slammed backward, a crimson flower blooming on his white shirt, his eyes wide with a final, silent question of betrayal. But Rochelle, though stunned, was far from helpless. The old sea captain reacted with primal instinct, heaving the heavy oak table between them and lunging forward with the jagged neck of a broken whiskey bottle. He slashed wildly at Aldrich's face, tearing a deep gash across his left cheek that would scar him for life, the sting of the whiskey in the wound a baptism of violence. What followed was not the clean execution Aldrich had planned, but a desperate, ugly brawl. Rochelle fought with the raw fury of a man who understood he was fighting a monster he had helped create. They crashed through crates, scattering incriminating ledgers, their blood smearing every surface as they grappled for the knife Aldrich had drawn. In the end, it was Rochelle's age that failed him. Aldrich finally drove the blade deep into Rochelle's stomach, twisting it. As the old sailor collapsed, clawing at his killer's throat, he managed to gasp out the words that would become Aldrich's curse. "My son. He knows everything. He'll come for you. When he's old enough, he'll make you pay." The words echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of the warehouse. Aldrich dismissed them as the ravings of a dying man. He had no idea that Marcus Devoe's younger brother, Philippe, had been secretly documenting their illegal activities. He had no idea that Samuel Rochelle's 17-year-old son, Henri, possessed a detailed knowledge of every transaction, every crime. Aldrich spent the next 4 hours methodically, coldly, staging the scene. He repositioned Devoe's body. He placed a bloody knife in Rochelle's hand. He scattered money. He even inflicted additional, superficial wounds on himself. The paid witnesses performed flawlessly. The corrupt dockworker swore he heard shouting. The overburdened New Orleans police, eager to close a messy case, accepted his version of events. Within a week, the warehouse was rubble. With his partners in the ground, Aldrich moved with chilling efficiency to absorb their wealth. He produced forged documents, liquidated every account, and seized a king's ransom. He believed he had committed the perfect crime. But he had forgotten the sons. And those sons would spend the next decade nursing a cold, patient hatred, meticulously planning a revenge so complete that death would seem a welcome mercy. Philippe Devoe was 22 when his brother was murdered, and his grief instantly curdled into a cold, diamond-hard fury. Unlike the impulsive Devoe men, Philippe possessed a sharp, calculating intelligence. He had kept his own set of records, coded ledgers, secret manifests. The official story was a lie, and he knew it. Within days of a funeral where he watched Aldrich feign sorrow, Philippe began his own shadow investigation. Meanwhile, Henri Rochelle, now 24, attacked the problem from a different angle. He had his father's connections but combined them with a formal education in law and finance. Working within New Orleans banking circles, he traced the money, laying bare the true scale of Aldrich's theft. Henri realized that the corrupt legal system would never deliver justice. The only way to destroy Aldrich was to use the man's own greed as a weapon. The two young men met in the fall of 1844. In a quiet French Quarter restaurant, their separate quests for justice merged into a single, terrifying conspiracy. By 1845, their plan was in motion, a campaign of betrayal, financial manipulation, and psychological warfare designed to be methodical, patient, and absolutely devastating. The first phase was infiltration. Philippe began moving in Aldrich's circles, studying his target's habits, his weaknesses, his vanities. He became a casual acquaintance, a friendly face at the card table, entirely non-threatening. At the same time, Henri, from within the city's financial institutions, mapped out Aldrich's empire. He discovered a structure built on sand, risky investments, massive loans, and, most crucially, a burgeoning gambling addiction. This addiction was the key. By 1848, Henri had secured a position at the First National Bank of New Orleans, the very institution holding the mortgage on Willowbrook. From the inside, he subtly tightened the screws. Loan renewals came with higher interest rates. Payment schedules were restructured. Simultaneously, Philippe cultivated relationships with the city's most notorious gambling operators. Through carefully placed bribes, he ensured Aldrich was invited to ever more expensive games, where the players secretly colluded to fleece him. At one such game, Philippe watched with cold satisfaction as Aldrich's confident bluster crumbled into sweaty-palmed panic, his face ashen under the gaslights as he lost a sum that would cripple him for a year. Their patience was their greatest weapon. They were engineering a slow, agonizing collapse. By 1851, the plan was bearing fruit. Aldrich's debts were astronomical. The constant pressure was corroding his personality, leaving him paranoid and dangerously desperate. But financial ruin was not enough. They wanted to inflict a humiliation so profound it would shatter his soul. It was Henri who devised the final masterstroke. They would exploit the deepest fear of every plantation owner. They would use Aldrich's marriage to one of his own enslaved people as the ultimate public degradation. The selection of Celeste was a masterstroke of calculated cruelty. At 38, Celeste was a formidable woman, but it was her searing intelligence and her absolute, unquenchable hatred for Jeremiah Aldrich that made her the perfect instrument. Her contempt for her owner was a cold, visible fire in her eyes. Her hatred was deeply personal. Aldrich had purchased her in 1847, callously separating her from her husband and 3 children. When she had wept and begged him to at least buy her youngest daughter, Aldrich had laughed in her face. For 7 years, she had endured the daily agony of cooking magnificent feasts for the man who had annihilated her family, all while waging her own secret war of sabotage, subtly oversalting his food to aggravate his chronic stomach ailments, accidentally ruining his prized possessions. Using free people of color as intermediaries, Philippe and Henri established contact. When they finally revealed their identities and their plan, Celeste's response was immediate. She would do whatever it took. Her only condition was her freedom and safe passage to Canada. They agreed without hesitation. They had found a partner in justice. The final plan was set. They would push Aldrich into absolute financial ruin. Then, they would present him with an ultimatum: marry Celeste, or face immediate death at the hands of creditors they controlled. The marriage would be his social execution, and it would put Celeste in the perfect position to administer the final stage of their vengeance, a slow, agonizing death by poison. All they needed was the right moment. The opportunity arrived in early 1854. Henri learned Aldrich was heading to a high-stakes gambling tournament in New Orleans, a last, desperate bid to save his plantation. It was the perfect moment to spring the trap. The gambling den where Jeremiah Aldrich would meet his fate was located in a converted warehouse near the New Orleans waterfront, a place reeking of stale cigar smoke, spilled whiskey, and the palpable desperation of men betting their entire futures on the turn of a card. The air was thick enough to chew, layered with the murmur of bets and the sharp clatter of poker chips. Aldrich, his face pale and haggard, took his seat at the high-stakes table, unaware that nearly every man there, from the dealer to the players flanking him, was in the employ of Philippe Deveau, who watched from the smoky shadows with eyes as cold as a winter grave. The game was a masterclass in psychological torture. Aldrich would win a small hand, a flicker of hope igniting in his eyes, only to be crushed in the next by an impossible run of cards. With every lost pot, another drop of sweat beaded on his brow. The walls of the room seemed to be closing in, the smug, predatory smiles of the other players twisting into demonic leers. This was the final brutal push designed to break him completely, leaving him so desperate he would grasp any hand offered, even one pulling him down into hell itself.